Honorable Perry, how are you? Hey, you're a glutton for punishment. How are you? Nice to see you. Thank you for coming. Let's see.
You're there.
Thank you. Pouring the gin right out.
I wish it was.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Zegart. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a senior fellow and co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation here at Stanford. We are delighted both institutions have come together to co-host this book event today with Graham Allison and Neil Ferguson to discuss Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? I want to remind all of you that the book is available for purchase outside, and Graham will stay and sign a few copies, I hope, at the end of the talk. So you can't escape the trap of the bookstore outside. Now, Graham Allison, as many of you know, is director of Harvard's Belfer Center. He is also the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government and founding dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Like legions of students, I vividly remember my first time walking into the Kennedy School for my first forum event back in 1986. It was an intoxicating place where you could feel the brain power working and the policy being changed in the room. And Graham Allison has been the Merlin behind this magic for a very long time, setting the standard of policy relevant scholarship since I think the time he was about 10 years old, back in 1986. He is the ultimate triple threat, serving in a number of distinguished positions in academia, in government, and in the private sector. He served as special advisor to the Secretary of Defense under Presidents Reagan and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy and Plans under President Clinton. He has been a trusted advisor to 7 Secretaries of Defense, both Democrat and Republican. He currently serves on the advisory boards of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He has the sole distinction of having been twice awarded the Department of Defense's highest civilian award, the Distinguished Public Service Medal, first by Cap Weinberger, and again by our own Bill Perry, who's here with us today. As many of you know, Graham Allison has written extensively about nuclear weapons, terrorism, and decision-making. His first book, Essence of Decision, explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, is one of the most influential books in political science and has become required reading for the vast majority of political science students today. Now, that's saying something. If you're a political scientist, you know that there have been so many articles and books written about the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's even been a peer-reviewed article about why we should stop writing articles and books about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is one of the most crowded intellectual landscapes in the discipline, and Graham Allison's book has stood the test of time. That book has sold more than 450,000 copies, which makes you, Graham, the Tom Clancy of our field. Now, he's written a number of other very influential books, including a 2000 book called Lee Kuan Yew, The Grandmaster's Insights on China, the US, and the World, co-authored with Bob Blackwell, and a book called Nuclear Terrorism, The Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe, now in its 3rd printing and selected by the New York Times as one of the 100 most notable books of the year when it came out. This book, Destined for War, is no different. Just for fun, I typed in best-selling political science books on Amazon.com, and the 3 authors that were clustered at the top were Ken Follett, Al Franken, and Graham Allison. Now, there's only one weakness in Graham Allison's illustrious career. He never saw the light as his colleague Neil Ferguson did to move from Harvard to Stanford. But I'm here today to say, Graham, it's not too late for you. So we hope after your visit, you'll come visit us for a longer period of time. Now, joining him in conversation today is his much smarter colleague who decided to move to California, Neil Ferguson, who I'm delighted to say is a colleague of mine as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Neil is also a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies, still at Harvard, and a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He is one of the world's leading economic historians, an astute and widely followed political commentator, and a prolific author. Graham Allison has sold 450,000 books. Neil Ferguson has written 450,000 books. Incredibly prolific author. His books, I'll just name a few. Kissinger, the latest, volume 1923 to 1968, The Idealist, a highly awarded book. Civilization, The West and the Rest. The Ascent of Money, a financial history of the world. You can tell he takes very niche topics. Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World, and of course Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire. You can also find him weekly in the London Sunday Times and the Boston Globe. Before coming to Stanford, he of course was professor of history at Harvard for 11 years, and before that he's taught at NYU, Oxford, and the London School of Economics. He's won a number of awards and perhaps is the only person I know who can say that he's won an international Emmy for his PBS series, The Ascent of Money, and the award for Best Documentary from the New York International Film Festival for his feature-length film, Kissinger. He was named by Time magazine one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And I have to add that in 2017, he achieved a first in the 100-year history of the Hoover Institution, which was to get every single fellow interested in international security affairs together for the first of what has become a series of salons, which has proven to provide incredibly fascinating, illuminating conversation. And you're about to see why when you hear these two professors talk about Graham Allison's book. Please join me in welcoming Graham Allison and Neil Ferguson.
You can see, Graham, that the introductions are better here than they are at Harvard, too. Thank you, Amy. So one thing Amy didn't mention is that Graham and I have also been co-authors. We published an article on applied history last year, arguing that the President of the United States needed a council of historical advisors, this one especially. And so we are not in an adversarial relationship, it's fair to say. Indeed, the book that we're going to talk about is a book that I watched evolve while I was at Harvard. And I have to congratulate you, Graham. You got the timing just right. And if you aren't worried now about the possibility of conflict between China and the United States, when you leave this room, I guarantee that you will be. Let me begin our conversation with a quotation from the book. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, alarm bells should sound. Danger ahead. China and the United States are currently on a collision course for war unless both parties take difficult and painful actions to avert it. And war between the United States and China in the decades ahead is not just possible, but much more likely than currently recognized. Indeed, on the historical record, war is more likely than not. Graham, I've got to ask you to set out your case, assuming that most people in the room have bought the book but not yet read it. Persuade us that war is more likely than not between the United States and China.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil, and thank you for participating in this event, and thank Amy and everybody here for organizing, and especially Amy and the joint venture with Hoover, and it's a great honor and opportunity for me to be here at Stanford. I did actually spend one very happy year at the Center for Advanced Studies back, I think, in the early 70s, and I thought I couldn't possibly come here because I wouldn't be able to do any work. It's too nice. There's too many other things to do. And I remember when Ken Arrow, who was a colleague at Harvard, came out here, I said to him, well, how do you get any work done? And he says, well, actually, I spend as much time in the sun as I used to spend shoveling snow. In any case, a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction. So, not for this group, but for general audiences, and especially for younger audiences today, the concept that there could be a war between great powers is just inconceivable. I mean, 7 decades without war, As students at Harvard often tell me, the war between great powers has been consigned to the dustbin of history. So it's not anything to do with the 20th century. It's like for previous centuries. So there just can't be wars between great powers anymore because there haven't been for a long time. And anybody with any historical sensibility will recognize how silly that observation is. This period of 7 decades is historically anomalous. John Gaddis's proposition about the long peace is, I think, a powerful proposition. So the notion that peace is either a natural condition of mankind or that for whatever reason our better angels have become so powerful or we've become so wise, or in any case, war between great powers is obsolete. I don't believe it for a second. So that's the premise. Now, in the case of US and China, I think every day there's noise and news about what's happening in this relationship. Either North Korea is testing some missiles, or China becomes the #1 trading partner of Germany, or there's a near collision in the South China Sea, or whatever. Is there some way to look beneath the surface of this daily noise and news to see something of the structure or even substructure of what's driving these events? And I came upon the idea that Thucydides had a great insight, and that insight basically helped illuminate what's happening today in the relationship with the US and China. Namely, a rising power is on a course and is threatening to displace a ruling power. Now, that storyline is as old as history itself. So Thucydides, the founder of history as we know it, said about the conflict between Athens and Sparta, the two great city-states of classical Greece, in this famous line that all students of international relations have studied. He said, quote, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable." So he identified a dynamic, the Thucydidean dynamic, in which a rising power feels bigger, stronger, thinks, well, okay, my interests deserve a little more weight. The current arrangements, which were set in place before I was bigger and stronger, are confining, even unfair. Maybe even I can remember some abuses. And the ruling power, looking at this, thinks this upstart is trying to upset the situation that's actually provided the environment in which it's able to grow. That's the only reason it became bigger and stronger, because I was helping provide an environment for it. So this dynamic between the rising power and the ruling power greatly it exhausts trust. So every action of one party is misinterpreted by the others. If I try to be benign, you suspect I have an ulterior motive, and vice versa. So magnification of misunderstandings, and similarly creates a great vulnerability to the impact of external actions or events in which something happens and then one thing triggers a reaction, and then there's a cascade at the end of which is an outcome that nobody would have imagined. So the dynamic here is not that in the rising ruling power relationship, one party decides war is a good idea. That's not the proposition. The proposition is rather, I think the current arrangements are great because they've provided a long period of peace. They've allowed you to grow rich, and as an American government official from time to time, I've given this speech to people. I believe it's true. The US constructed in the aftermath of World War II an economic and security order which has provided for longer peace and greater prosperity than China ever saw in its whole 5,000 years. So they should be extremely grateful. And they should actually participate in this international rule-based order. That's what we tell them. And they say, who wrote these rules? And where were we when the rules were written? And are the rules fair from our perspective? And shouldn't they be adjusted? Maybe I should have more say. I should have more sway. And we say, sit in your place. You should be happy. You should be grateful. So this dynamic leads us then to be vulnerable to events like what's happening in Korea. If what was happening in Korea was happening in a relationship between the US and Britain, so let's imagine Ireland was becoming obstreperous in a way that was threatening to the two parties. the British and the Americans would sit down and say, a little pipsqueak like this cannot disturb relations between two big states. No, forget about it. Let's just sit down, solve this problem, and if we can't agree on some things, we'll flip a coin. But in any case, we can find a way to work this problem. In the relationship between the US and China, as we watch what happens in North Korea, the Chinese actually, as you know very well, Neil, haven't participated in this conversation you and I did. We were both part of a very high-level Track 2 post-mortem on Mar-a-Lago with both Americans and Chinese who had been present at the meeting. From a Chinese perspective in Beijing, the problem in Korea is only that we're there. There would be no problem in Korea if the Americans were not in Korea. We would solve this problem in a second. And from the American perspective, the idea that, wait a minute, we don't belong there. Excuse me, we fought a war there. 40,000 Americans died there. We helped build a society there. It's a very successful democracy. It's the 13th largest market economy in the world. So we're not walking away from that and saying, adios, thank you very much. We're proud of this, and we should be proud of it. We have a defense relationship. We should. So you say, well, so the problem is you, North China, you should solve this problem with these little guys that are your guys. They're your ally. They're the one that's creating the problem. So I think as you've written, Neil, I think brilliantly about World War I, if you go back and ask about World War I, I have a good chapter in the book, I think, if you're just doing it in single chapter terms. I do not believe you can study World War I too much. It's totally dumbfounding. I think that Bateman's answer after the war, when people said, well, how did this happen? And he said, if we only knew. Still is the right answer. So how could the assassination of an Archduke in Sarajevo by a Serbian terrorist, so the Archduke nobody really cares much about except the guy in Vienna. In Sarajevo, they told him he shouldn't go there. Okay? The guy that assassinates him is a Serbian terrorist from a group called the Black Hand. Again, if you're writing a movie, you wouldn't make this up. Okay? And that becomes the spark that creates a fire that burns down the whole house of Europe. It's crazy. I mean, it makes no sense. Did anybody want the war that they got? No. The Austro-Hungarians would like to have had to smush the Serbs because of the way they were behaving. But actually, Gray's plan, as you pointed out, would have allowed him to do that without having a great war. But what happened was one thing led to the other, and by the end, everybody had lost the thing they cared about most. In fact, if I do one more second on it, I think, because I do think it's so startling, and I think it's so relevant as we try to think about China and the U.S. There's nobody in the U.S. wants a war with China. And I don't know of a single person at defense who doesn't think that would be crazy. And I think there's no one in the Chinese Ministry of Defense that thinks a war with the U.S. is a good idea. I think they understand war would be catastrophic. But in the end of World War I, what had happened to what each of the parties cared most about? It was gone. The Austro-Hungarians were trying to hold together an empire. It had dissolved. The emperor had gone. The Russian Tsar was backing the Serbs. His whole regime has been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, the communists. The Kaiser is trying to back his buddy in Vienna. He's gone. The French are backing the Russians. They've been bled of their youth for a whole generation. The society never recovers. And Britain, which has been a great creditor nation for 100 years, is turned into a debtor and is on a path to decline. So if you'd given these people a chance for a do-over, nobody, not a single one would have made the choices that he did, but they made the choices, one thing led to the other, and God knows that's what happened. So I think a situation in which nobody wants war, the war that you get, in which everybody knows war would be nuts, doesn't mean war can't happen. Yeah.
And your analogy here would be the rivalry between Britain and Germany, which many historians have seen as central to the outbreak of that war. Right. In this case, Britain in 1914 was the incumbent power, as the United States is today. Germany was the rising power as China is today. They were both heavily interdependent economically, and nevertheless, conflict came with disastrous consequences.
Right, and they had both become, because of this thucidity and rivalry, in my reading of it, and I think it's consistent with your own history of it, they had each then become entangled with other parties about whom they would not otherwise have been so entangled. So, if it had been Bismarck in Germany, he would have understood exactly how weak the Austro-Hungarians were and not about to let them drag him into something. Actually, he would have never let the alliance with Russia lapse. But you got a Kaiser who didn't know what he was doing, trying to run the German hand, and they begin to make these mistakes. Similarly, in the British case, the British had been very careful for 400 years not to get too entangled with any one of the other parties on the continent. So they were watching but fearful of Germany, they had succumbed to, well, okay, I guess we better talk to the French more about this. I guess maybe we should have more relationships with the Russians, even though the Brits were very worried about the Russians, as you wrote, because they thought the Russians were threatening their empire in India.
So in the book, I should explain, Graham actually gives you 16 cases of an incumbent power feeling threatened by a rising power, and makes, and this is the political science part, the argument in 12 out of 16, this results in conflict. So I'd like to talk more in a minute about that 1914 analogy, which I think is a very powerful one. And then I'd like to get on to the contemporary parallel in which sort of small rogue regime, Serbia 1914, North Korea today, ends up precipitating conflict. Before we get there, can we talk a bit about Thucydides? It's worth pointing out to this audience that you may not have read the Peloponnesian War and you may not have read Thucydides, but China's leaders sure have. Just out of interest, could you raise your hand if you've read the Peloponnesian War, all or part of it? Oh, very good. It's almost like being back at Oxford.
Let me make a shout out. Apologies, just Neil, because I like this very much. You can go right now when you're done, or even now, and download for free onto your Kindle or Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, and only just read the first 100 pages, book one, and it'll knock your socks off. I'm guaranteeing, knock your socks off for free. Yeah. So, I hope you like the other book too, which you have to pay for. But
it's not downloadable for free yet, but I'm sure somebody's working on it, Graham. Watch out. So let's just briefly talk about Thucydides. One of the most remarkable things for me is that this has become something that China's leaders refer to. Xi Jinping himself referred to the Thucydides trap in a speech, I think it was in Seattle, remind me if I've got that wrong. And we heard just the other day the Chinese ambassador in the United States refer to it too. So it may seem arcane if you're not into ancient history. It doesn't seem arcane in Beijing, that's for sure. Just one question on that. Who is Sparta and who's Athens in this analogy? Because I'm not quite sure.
Well, I think that this is certainly not isomorphic. So it's not like this is exactly like that. And actually, as our mutual colleague and the founder, we think of the work that Neil and I have tried to do together on applied history, Ernest May would point out to us, when you get attracted to an analogy, be careful. Always take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle of the page and write similar at the top of one column and different at the top of the other column. And if you can't make 3 bullet points under each, take an aspirin and consult a historian. Okay. So these are not exactly like. In fact, in the Spartan case, as you know, Neil, very well, and people may not remember, Sparta had been the ruler of Greece for 100 years. So that was the normal circumstance. The Persians had come, and there was a big war with the Persians. That's what we call Iranians now. And Athens had built a fleet, actually the first professional navy. So their navy, the people were professional. They worked all the time. Whereas other guys just rode, were soldiers who rode, and lo and behold, if you're a professional, you can do a little bit better than, a pickup game. So they produced a pretty impressive navy, and then they actually had created an alliance structure. Together, Athens and Sparta then defeated the Persians. Whereupon there was this, something that's happened, it's happened a few other times in history, but there was this explosion of creative energy in Athens, just unbelievable. What did the Athenians invent? I just came from an event that in Silicon Valley with people in the tech world, and I said, you get to think you're reinventing the world. What did these guys invent in 50 years? Okay, they invented drama. So Sophocles, Aristophanes, Euripides, history, Thucydides, Herodotus, philosophy, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, democracy, Pericles, architecture. Look at the Parthenon. You can find a better building in California than, excuse me. This was, so from Sparta, people are looking out saying, these people are totally out of control. Every day they get up and they invent crazy new things that don't seem very comfortable to us. Sparta was a martial society. It was essentially imagine SEAL Team 6 is your whole society. So when kids are 4 years old, you check them out. If they don't have any prospect, you put them in one lane, the other ones you kill them, okay? And then you grow them up, and the males have to live in barracks until they're 25 years old. They can't get married till they're 30. They're all the time marching around getting ready to fight people. And lo and behold, they're very good at it. That's what they do. But the idea of drama and history and philosophy and architecture and guys in navies, this all seemed very, very, very threatening to the Spartans. And so they said to the Spartans, look, the way things are the way things are supposed to be. So after the war with the Persians, the Athenians wanted to build back their wall to protect them from invasions by people like the Spartans. Spartans told them, no, you cannot have a wall. Because if we need to discipline you, we need to be able to march there. The Athenians disobeyed us, the incumbent power, and built this wall. Now, why would they build this wall? Probably because they didn't want to obey us. So then it started from there. And I think there's no, if you said, what's the similarities between the US and China? I think there are obviously extreme differences in both cases, but from an American perspective, the international order that we have helped build and provide and manage over 7 decades has actually worked very well. If you put it in broad historical terms, I would give the Americans high marks in many areas. But from a Chinese perspective, that was then, and I think China has emerged to be a great power now, and things should be adjusted, and particularly in the Asian arena, they wonder, why is the US Navy the arbiter of events in the South China Sea? They look up every day and they see, here's the US Navy and it's patrolling their borders, and when there's a dispute about an island, or somebody wants to build an island, we have an opinion, and we think our opinion should dominate because we're the dominant Navy there. I tell them, wait, we've been there ever since the Battle of Midway. We provided the environment in which things have been so calm and so peaceful that you've been able to develop as you have. Otherwise, what could have happened between you and Japan, or what would have happened between even you and India, and otherwise? But they look and they say, well, maybe, I mean, even in the best of cases, certainly the academic-related people would say, I agree with you, yes, you have a point, but that was then, and now is now. So please, it's time for you to leave.
So we are, in that sense, Sparta, and
Yes.
China's the Athenians. It's funny though, because when you read the Peloponnesian War, you can't help feeling that the Athenians sound an awful lot like Americans.
They do.
The nature of the case first compelled us to advance our empire to its present height, fear being our principal motive, though honor and interest came afterward. We didn't really want this empire, but we just have it, and it's law-based. I always think the Athenians have a distinctly American quality to them. In that sense, the analogy is not quite perfect, but we'll come back in a minute to what I think is the better analogy, which is the Germany-Britain pre-1914 analogy. Before we do that, can we talk about your cases when things turned out well? Because if there's one thing that this book can tell us, I guess, it's how to avoid a version of 1914 between the United States and China. You give us 4 examples of things turning out okay. One of which is the Cold War itself, the US-Soviet relationship. What should we learn from those exceptions, from the minority of cases when people, great powers, avoided the trap?
So I have a chapter in the book called 12 Clues for Peace. And I try to draw both from the failures and from the successes. The 4 success stories, briefly, are Spain versus Portugal at the end of the 15th century, the rise of the US relative to Britain at the beginning of the 20th century, the Cold War, as the US met the surge of the Soviet Union, and then finally a stretch case, but the open case of Germany emerging in the post-Cold War period as the dominant power in Europe. So from each of these cases, I think there's lots and lots of things to learn. The two most instructive, I think, are the rise of the US relative to Britain and the Cold War. In the case of the rise of the US relative to Britain, the British had two problems in the sense that they had a rising Germany that was more proximate and more directly seen as a threat because the Germans were building a navy that seemed very threatening to Britain, and a rising US who only wanted the Brits out of our hemisphere. Now, I have a chapter, again, most Americans will find very uncomfortable, but which I find delicious, because Teddy Roosevelt is one of my heroes. So I'm a big admirer of Teddy Roosevelt. But I tell the story of America as we're merging into what Teddy Roosevelt was supremely confident was going to be an American century, which it was. So in 1897, a 37-year-old Teddy Roosevelt arrives in Washington as the #2 person in the Department of the Navy. So at the time, there was only the Secretary of the Navy, there was the Assistant Secretary, that was it. So he's the #2 person. He had for 15 years been railing about what he called the abomination of Spain in our hemisphere, particularly in Cuba. Spain was occupying Cuba. But also the British having their navies all the time, he was seeing them, and the German Navy and others. So what happened in the decade after Teddy Roosevelt arrived in Washington? And you can read in the chapter about it, but just briefly. First, there was a mysterious explosion on a ship in Havana Harbor. We took it as an occasion to declare war against Spain. We liberated Cuba, we took Puerto Rico, we took Guam. That's how Guam became to be part of American territory. There was Teddy Roosevelt wanted a canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific so our fleet could go back and forth. Colombia wouldn't give us the canal we wanted. We sponsored a coup. We created a new country. It's called Panama. Next day, it gave us a contract for our canal. There was a territorial dispute in Venezuela in which the British and the Germans were attempting to settle the matter. Teddy Roosevelt said to them, "You don't even have any right to any dispute, any discussion here, out of our hemisphere, or else we'll have a war with you." I mean, threatened war with each one of them in turn. Each of them decided better to leave. Okay? And finally, we stole the largest part of the fat tail of Alaska, which is another delicious tale where John Muir, who was a buddy of Teddy Roosevelt, had gone up there exploring and had written back to him saying that a river there, the Stickeen River, which is the main river in Tongass National Forest. Tongass National Forest, look it up on the map, is our largest national forest in the US. It's bigger than West Virginia. It's part of the territory we stole, okay? So this river, he had wrote back to him and said, this is like 100 Yosemites. And this was the same Muir of Muir Woods, a guy who had taken Teddy Roosevelt camping in Yosemite, whereupon Teddy Roosevelt said, this has got to be a national park. So that's Yosemite. So Teddy Roosevelt turns to his Secretary of State and he says, he said, 100 Yosemites, this is America. And the Secretary of State said, no, sir, this is Canada. And he said, do it again. 100 Yosemites is America. So we threatened war with Canada, and we took it. Okay? We didn't pay for it at all. So he announced the Roosevelt Corollary. Again, most people remember the Monroe Doctrine, but they don't remember the Monroe Doctrine said this is our hemisphere, foreigners should be out of here, European foreigners. The Roosevelt Corollary said if any nation in our hemisphere misbehaves, as we decide that it's misbehaved, we will send the Marines and change the government. And every year thereafter, for the next decade, we send the Marines somewhere and change some government somewhere. So if Xi Jinping or his successor should ever be inspired by Teddy Roosevelt, then for sure we'll find ourselves on a very desperate path.
Because by comparison with that conduct, and the more you describe it, the more outraged I become. wonder why we put up with it, really.
Exactly.
By comparison with this behavior, China's been circumspect.
Yes.
Even on issues which frequently appear in the US media, the South China Sea, for example, there's nothing to compare with the kind of aggressive assertion of primacy that the United States engaged in
Absolutely.
in the time of Teddy Roosevelt.
And I have a wonderful quotation that Neil, from this great British tradition. Lord Salisbury is the Prime Minister of Britain in 1902. And he's looking at the situation wistfully, as Teddy Roosevelt has done one outrageous thing after another, not showing any respect whatever for Britain. And he says, if we had intervened in the Civil War, we could have had two Americas, and this all wouldn't be happening to us. But tragically, he says, in this life, if you don't take opportunity when it arises, you don't get a second chance.
But the lesson from that seems to me to be a very interesting one. The United Kingdom decided not to intervene in the Civil War because, on balance, liberal opinion in the country was against the Confederacy. Right. And there was that degree of cultural similarity across the Atlantic that by the 1900s, nobody really minded terribly the prospect of US predominance and of a kind of senior partner, junior partner relationship emerging, as indeed happened in the 20th century. But that analogy doesn't apply in the case of the relationship between the United States and China. If China started to behave a la Teddy Roosevelt, nobody here would simply say, oh, well, that's just China being China, and it'll be fine when we're the junior partners and they're the senior partners.
Absolutely.
Relax, let's worry about Russia. It's not going to be like that if China becomes more assertive.
I agree. And the brilliance of the British accommodation was that they first distinguished between what was vital for Britain. So they wanted to keep their empire, including Canada. The U.S. could have actually taken Canada. And Teddy Roosevelt was interested in British Columbia. So he looked at that more than once. And the British were aware that the U.S. looked at it more than once. But they, noticing what's vital and what's just vivid, but which we can adjust to, they tolerated behavior that would otherwise be, it was certainly crude and unreasonable and unfair, but nonetheless, they helped the Americans to see that American interests and British interests were actually, in terms of most important interests, quite aligned. And there was the cultural similarities that you mentioned. And then, therefore, by the time World War I comes, the U.S. is the natural supply line for Britain. Britain wouldn't have done very well in World War I, even at the beginning of the war, if it hadn't been for U.S. supplies and U.S. money for loans for the war. And then when the U.S. entered the war, it was natural that the U.S. entered as the ally with Britain. And in between the wars, U.S. and Britain became even thicker. So in the Washington Naval Conference of 1921, the Americans agreed even to have equal numbers of ships with the Brits, letting them feel better about it, even though the U.S. was by then, half again bigger in terms of GDP and could have had a much, much bigger Navy. And then when World War II comes, the U.S. is again naturally aligned with Britain. So the idea of taking account of where your interests are vital and then where then we can be aligned, and then recognizing that in other areas we're going to have strong differences of views, and then if I'm not powerful enough, I can adjust. I think there's a big lesson for us there, even as we think about China, because it's not the cultural affinity, for sure. These are two different cultures. I have in a chapter in the book called Clash of Civilizations, taking up Sam Huntington's proposition, which I think is basically correct, Sam Huntington's, and all I do is elaborate on it a little bit. But I think if you said, what in terms of vital interests, what interests do the U.S. and China share? In the book I say three. One, not having a general nuclear war. We have a relationship with them like we had with the Soviet Union of mutual assured destruction. That means that if I do my best to disarm you, after that you can still kill me. So we're like, as I say in the book, Siamese twins. Imagine, again, it's a grotesque image, but imagine you wake up one day and Neil and I each still have our head and we still have our arms, but our backbone and our respiratory system has been fused. So then however mischievous I am, however evil I am, however demonic I am, however much you want to strangle me, you keep thinking, this guy deserves to be strangled, but if I strangle him, I'm going to commit suicide. That's not a good idea. So maybe I have to figure a way to live with him. So one, that provides, as it did and was an important part of the Cold War. Secondly, the economies are deeply interlaced, not just as they were between Britain and France, which were highly economically interdependent, but even in supply chains. So if you had a war between the US and China, Walmarts wouldn't have any goods, and Chinese factories would be making stuff for whom? Nobody, and we wouldn't be able to get loans, okay? So that doesn't look like a good idea. So there's enough to build in there. Third, climate. Again, not everybody in the US I know agrees with the proposition, but I think everybody who studied the proposition agrees that in the current pattern of use of energy and greenhouse gas emissions, we may succeed in making a globe 100 years from now that your great-great-great-grandchildren can't live in. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So there's no way the US could do anything to solve that problem if China is not collaborative, and there's no way China could solve this problem if the US is not. So you got three at least big areas where you could imagine trying to find some alignment, and then you have other areas where you have to mention some adopting.
So this, I want to open this up to the audience in just 5 minutes. I'm going to ask you one more question and then give the crowd a chance to ask you questions. You're almost persuading me that they're not destined for war because of the mutually assured destruction, the economic interdependence, and then these environmental concerns. Let's now look closely at a plausible scenario in which the United States and China could nevertheless, despite these common interests, end up in conflict. And you and I chatted about this over lunch yesterday. I think we both agree that what is unfolding in North Korea has the potential to be a cause of conflict. Give us that scenario. Maybe just looking ahead a matter of months. Nobody in the summer of 1914 expected that Britain and Germany by August would be at war over such arcane questions as Serbian self-determination, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the neutrality of Belgium. Tell me how, despite their common interests, the United States and China could end up in a conflict over North Korea.
Okay, so I have a chapter in the book called From Here to War, and I have 5 scenarios for getting there, but let's just stay with the one that I think is most urgent right now and that Neil and I were chatting about yesterday. So think of a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, over the course of 13 days, the US and the Soviet Union came to a point in which we almost attacked the missiles in Cuba, and if we had done, we would likely have had a general war with Russia, a Soviet Union, maybe even a nuclear war. So remember, just to, again in brief, the Soviet Union was discovered placing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. This is October 1962. President John F. Kennedy said this is not going to happen, and actually was prepared to attack the missiles in Cuba to prevent them being completed in such a way that they could attack the American homeland, and actually engaged in a confrontation that he thought had a 1 in 3 chance of nuclear war to prevent this happening. And we survived. Now, it's a long story, but in any case, this happened over 13 days. In the current situation, I would say not 13 days for sure, but the next 13 months maybe, or maybe it'll be 26 months, but then immediately ahead, the next year or two, either track 1, the train's coming down, this is Kim Jong-un, he's going to acquire the ability to strike San Francisco with a nuclear warhead. That's track 1. And track 2 is President Trump, who says, my train will crash into yours before you reach that point if you continue going down your track. So you got these 2 trains moving inexorably towards a point of collision. So you look and think, well, wait a minute, let me do this again. Most people who haven't been following North Korea will not quite remember. Most of you here probably know enough, but let me just go back through the thing. Because Secretary Perry and I I was working for Secretary Perry in 1994 when we went through this exercise the first time. At the Defense Department, if a vote had been taken, and I was talking to Bill yesterday about this, certainly Ash Carter, who was working for him at the time, and me, who was working for him at the time, and Bill would have attacked North Korea to prevent North Korea enriching or reprocessing plutonium that would allow it, after a few more steps, to become a nuclear weapon state. Because how can you possibly live in a world in which a little isolated, impoverished, nutty state like North Korea has nuclear weapons? We shouldn't live in such a world, and if we could prevent it, we should prevent it. Now, of course, there was great risk in attacking North Korea, even at that time. For sure, our South Korean ally would have a heart attack, as the president of South Korea said to the president of the US. And maybe this would end up triggering a response that would cause a lot of damage in South Korea. But in any case, I was in favor of it then, and I think even as I look back on it now, I believe that the Secretary of Defense's view was right. So I wish we had attacked them then. We wouldn't be where we are now. If that had provoked the Second Korean War, probably I would have said, well, I'm not sure I thought this was a good idea. But you know, in life you sometimes have to make very hard choices. That was a hard choice. I think I would stick with the view that I held at the time, and that was held at the Defense Department, not by some of the rest of the government. But in any case, this same little North Korea has now an arsenal of 20 or 25 nuclear weapons. So that's not a hypothetical, that's a fact. This same North Korea has tested and deployed short-range missiles that CIA says can deliver nuclear warheads to South Korea. That's already now. This same little country has developed medium-range missiles and tested them and deployed them that the CIA says can deliver nuclear warheads against Japan. So that's where we are now. And it's this train, so the train has already gone through 4 stations, and it's just coming to the last station, which is to be able to deliver a warhead against the American homeland. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, now we have a rival of Donald Trump. So Donald Trump heard about this for the first time in his life when he became president-elect. No, that's what he said. He said, he met with President Obama. He was president-elect, and President Obama said, let me tell you, there's a real crisis brewing here. It's in North Korea. North Korea is going to acquire the ability to attack the American homeland. Now, I never heard of this in my life. This is impossible. I mean, it is. It's unbelievable. It's an unbelievable thing if you haven't been studying it. I mean, go to the restaurant tonight and go to the next table over and say, there's a little country called North Korea that has nuclear weapons and it might be able to attack San Francisco. They won't believe you. Nobody would believe you. I mean, it's not believable, even to me, but it's a fact, okay? So in any case, Donald Trump left the meeting and within an hour tweeted, not gonna happen. This is not gonna happen. And every day since then, he said, I'm telling you, maybe Clinton let this happen, and maybe Bush let this happen, and maybe Obama let this happen, but I'm not those guys, okay? They just let the thing go down the road. I'm not going to allow the USA to be threatened by nuclear weapons from Kim Jong-un. It just makes no sense. And I'll do whatever's required to prevent it. So at the Mar-a-Lago summit between Xi Jinping and Trump, Trump said to him, look, you can solve this problem. But if you don't solve this problem, I can solve this problem. And if I do, you're not going to like it. And then he served them chocolate cake for dinner. He excused himself, and he went and announced that we had launched 50 cruise missiles against Syria. Just to underline the point, how can we solve this problem? We can solve this problem. So can we launch 50 cruise missiles against North Korea to ruin their launching pads so that they don't conduct these tests? Absolutely. The Defense Department will have no problem doing this. And they can do a lot worse than that. But the question is, if we were to do that, that's step 1. Now, how about step 2? So currently, the view is, well, maybe step 2 is that the North Koreans only use their artillery, not nuclear weapons. Maybe they only use their artillery, and they attack Seoul. Well, they may be able to kill 1 million people in 48 hours or so. A lot of people in Seoul. And if they do that, maybe then people, cooler heads obtain and we say, time out, we should stop, we're on a dangerous road. Or maybe the Americans and the South Koreans say, wait a minute, this crazy guy has already killed 1 million people. He's got a capacity to kill way more than that. We better destroy all the ability, all the rockets and all the missiles that he has now, preemptively, before he attacks us, or before he attacks South Korea, before he attacks our base, before he attacks Japan. So maybe, and if we do, will we succeed in getting all the targets? Well, I'd say every target we can identify, we can destroy. But are we able to identify all the targets? Well, probably not. Again, that will be classified at this point, but I would say probably not. Well, maybe he responds by dropping a nuclear weapon on South Korea or Japan. Well, and Colin Powell told his counterpart at one stage, if a nuclear weapon from North Korea ever explodes on the territory of an American ally, within the same hour, we're going to turn the entirety of North Korea into a charcoal biscuit. Okay? So can we do that? You bet. But that's like, 25 million people live there. Most of them poor slobs who are in a prison, in a madhouse. Okay, they're not part of this story. So you're going to go destroy that many targets and that many people, and in what way? And then are the Chinese going to sit by and watch this game? Because if at the end of this story you have a unified Korea under the government that's a military ally of the US, Chinese, as you and I heard at this meeting say, wait a minute, no, that's unacceptable from our perspective. We already fought a war with you over this the last time. Anybody that can't believe that Americans and Chinese can kill each other, go back and read about World War I. About the Korean War, about the Korean War. In 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea, almost captured the whole country. US came to the rescue, very last minute, pushed the North Koreans right back up the peninsula. We're approaching the border with China. Out of nowhere MacArthur was just completely stunned, 300,000 Chinese, and they entered the war and they beat us right back down the peninsula to the 38th parallel where the war had begun in the first case. So China has demonstrated that it's prepared to go to war and to fight to prevent having a hostile American-related government on its border. Now, would they do it again, particularly given these new conditions and the fact that it could escalate to hell? I don't know. But they would ask us, are you prepared to get involved in a war that also might escalate to hell because we both go to hell together? And I'd say, stay tuned, yeah.
So you've now created a distinctly chilly silence in the room. I want to just add a little vignette. 1950, commencement at Harvard. A young Henry Kissinger is getting his degree. Dean Acheson does the commencement address, the one that Mark Zuckerberg gave this year. And Acheson, in the course of his foreign policy remarks, says words to the effect that a war is not about to break out. 3 days later, the Korean War begins. So just beware. These things can happen very much faster than you expect. So as I said, you arrived here probably not thinking too much about this scenario, and you're going to leave here thinking a lot more about it. Because as Graham says, there is a precedent, there is a casus belli, and I can assure you, on the basis of conversations that I've had in the last few weeks, this is a very plausible scenario in the eyes of both US and Chinese decision makers. The good news is, and I should say this because this event is sponsored but not only by the Center for International Security and Cooperation, but also by the Hoover Institution, to which I proudly belong. Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, is on leave from being a Hoover Fellow, and he has read Thucydides.
You bet.
And I suspect that H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, another former Hoover Fellow, has also done his reading on this. So it's not entirely in the hands of President Trump, who I'm pretty sure has not read the Peloponnesian War. With that, I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'm going to pick you or not. A microphone is going to come to you. You're going to say who you are briefly. We don't need the whole life story. And ask a question. No speeches. If you start making a speech, I'm from Glasgow, I will just cut you off. All right? Hope that's all clear. There's a gentleman right there in a blue shirt who's going to have the first question. Just tell us who you are, sir, and ask your question.
My name is George Koo, and I'm convinced I'm going to have to read a book. But I have a metaphor to present and see what you think. The Thucydides trap is based on the assumption that like a two hands clapping. But it seems to me in the US-China case, it could only be a one hand clapping because, as you mentioned, the culture is so different. And I see the US making all the aggressive moves. I don't see China countering. So if it's a one hand clapping situation, are we going to have the Thucydides trap?
Okay,
Thank you.
good question.
An excellent question.
I'll try to be, because there are a lot of questions, each question could be a long discussion, and so, but apologize if I just be telegraphic. I think if I look at the situation, I don't think the Chinese are not clapping in the South China Sea. I think the Chinese believe that the South China Sea is as much their lake as Teddy Roosevelt thought the Caribbean was an American lake. Now, we can agree, or we can argue whether this makes any sense for a big and strong power to say, water on my periphery, kind of, I'm the overseer of it because I'm big and I'm strong. That's the way things are. But that's not the way things have been. But the Chinese are not happy to have the number of islands that used to be in the South China Sea. They think there should be a few extra ones, and they built them. And they're not happy to have the islands divided the way they had been. They think the Vietnamese have claimed some islands, and the Filipinos have claimed some islands, and they think actually all these islands look like my islands, in the same way that Teddy Roosevelt said, I think this looks like, my river. So I think I don't agree with the proposition that there's nobody clapping on the other side.
In fairness, though, I think on the North Korean issue, at this point, you're right. And the Chinese, at this point, seem keen to go along with the idea that the United States and China can work together to deal with the North Korean problem. Now, I say this with some authority, having heard a very interesting conversation at a high level on this subject over the weekend. So I think at this point, Trump's strategy, the Mar-a-Lago strategy of saying to China, this is your problem, you better deal with it, seems to be going quite well. And I take the view that of all the things that have happened since he became president, this has been so far the most successful. The problem is, what happens if China doesn't deliver in the eyes of the administration? And at that point, Trump is going to be in a red line situation. Because at that point, he's going to have to either back down and accept the North Korean nuclear program is ongoing, or take military action. And that, I think, is when it gets dangerous. And at that point, there's no knowing quite how the Chinese will respond. Okay, further questions. President Ilves, please.
I'm Thomas Ilves. I'm a visiting fellow here at CSAC. Well, I just throw something else into the equation to make it worse, which is that already in Davos this year, you might recall that President Xi was already being hailed as the new driver of liberalism, at least economic liberalism. But certainly what we have seen after the debacle at the NATO summit, and the response of Angela Merkel and some other people, I mean, you can sense Europe saying, well, we better start working with the Chinese. And the Germans are already having this big powwow, economic powwow. At the same time, China, whether it works or not, and there are indications that maybe it's not working so well, but they're making a major push toward Europe, and with transit and so forth. And certainly I know in the case of Eastern Europe, they've even had two separate summits with the countries in the European Union, but are formerly communist, and drawing a lot of I mean, they're just they're very big players. They have a lot of cash, and so on top of the U.S.-Chinese rivalry, I actually see that kind of the behavior towards Europe right now is going to distance Europe from the United States, saying, well, if the United States is going to be like that, I mean, we have to do something too. And so it actually, I think, is a worse picture than simply the two-party conflict.
So I agree. I think that you have here the general Thucydidean and dynamic. So I think Thucydides would say, I got the general picture. The rising power gets bigger and stronger, and other third parties. So the third party action is very interesting to watch in the case of the Peloponnesian War. Other parties look to see who's the relatively stronger power and who's rising and who's falling, and then adjust themselves because they're looking after themselves. So already across Asia, countries have noticed that China is their dominant trading partner, and that China is mean and is prepared to squeeze them when it feels it's in their interests. So lo and behold, they've adapted and adjusted. And you can see that right across ASEAN. And in fact, if you look at the institutions that people tried to build in Asia to counterbalance China, like ASEAN, you can see them weakening because Chinese prefer to deal with parties one-on-one. In the European case, again, as one looks at the picture, first you got what's happening to the economic balance of power. China is today the largest economy in the world, measured by the single best yardstick, if you just had to pick one, which is purchasing power parity. I have a long discussion of this in the book, and many people will disagree with it, I'm sure, but in any case, CIA and IMF both believe that purchasing power parity is the best way to compare relative strengths of economies. So by that measure, China already. So who is now the biggest trading partner with Germany? China. Who is the main source of capital for most places if you're looking for new capital? Germany. Who's the place that provides loans? Now, the Chinese development banks, the four of them, including AIIB, have 4 times the capital of the World Bank. So if you're a country and you're looking for a loan, you go to China. And the loans, yes, they use the loans for political purposes, of course. And they use the loans to provide contracts. So I think you're seeing this dynamic. Then this is exacerbated. I was asked this, I've been on this week-long rollout for this book. This is the middle of the second week. Somebody's saying, well, but have you found any case in which the ruling power then just basically vacates the field in an arena like the climate arena, or like you have an alliance with a bunch of strong parties and you weaken that alliance? And I've not been able to find one of those. So I think this case may be original in that regard. And the idea that Xi Jinping and China should be the global leader in green, it's mind-blowing. I mean, this is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Yes, indeed, they did reach at Paris an accord, a very important accord, I think, at least in the recognition of the problem. And yes, they're investing money in building green industries, but they are the biggest emitter. The idea that China is the champion of liberal trade, again, it's breathtaking as an idea. China is the most mercantilist, protectionist economy, I think, of any big economy. So how can you manage that? Well, if the contender leaves the field, I guess, I'm the only guy left standing. Yeah.
This illustrates really well the importance of the other players. Although it's very tempting, especially if you've studied the Cold War at length, to lapse into a kind of two-player game framework. What Thucydides shows is that really it's the alliances and the relationships with the lesser powers that are crucial in the origins of the Peloponnesian War. Corinth, how is Corinth going to play it? And I think in exactly the same way your book shows that what really matters here is not just how China and the United States relate to one another, but how others will respond to that. And I think it's already clear that key American allies are nervous as can be, specifically on the issue of how the United States is going to handle North Korea, the South Koreans, for example, are far from comfortable with the direction that things are going.
I would predict that the American-South Korean relationship will become very stressed over the months ahead, because, I mean, the reality of the situation, and you almost wouldn't like to say this out loud, but Lindsey Graham went on television, made this speech about it, so it's not like it, and strategically you can look and see the situation. Trump's proposition is that in order to prevent North Korea from being able to do to San Francisco what North Korea has already been allowed to be able to do to Seoul or to Tokyo, we are prepared to take a course of action that's likely to cause a war in your country. So I think President Moon is looking at this and thinking, where is the biggest threat to me in the short run? And how do I feel about this? And I think we're going to actually, in the Japanese relationship, it'll be interesting to watch too. I haven't looked at that carefully lately, but I think in the South Korean relationship, I think this is going to become very stressful.
And we haven't even mentioned Russia. Yes, it's going to be a fascinating discussion. We have 25 minutes. That means we're going to try and get about 5 questions, maybe more. Let me just see. I don't want to be biased against any part of the room. So I'll go right to the back on the other side. The gentleman in the blue shirt there. Yes. Yes, sir. You, sir. Right at the back.
David Mulford, Hoover.
David, just grab that microphone.
Hi, David Mulford.
Grab
How are
that-
you?
grab
How are
that
you?
microphone, David.
Other countries, could you put Japan and especially India into this picture, please?
Japan and India, David.
Yes.
Graham.
Again, I'll just try to be very, very quick. I would say in the case of Japan, Japan's the 3rd largest economy in the world. Japan has a serious defense establishment. If you were to have a naval war just between the two parties in the East China Sea, between Japan and China today, with the balance of forces, I would bet on Japan. Okay, if it was just a sea encounter, that won't continue, but over time, currently, and the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty is a very strong treaty. So I would say Japan is a big player, and one of China's problems, and one of the reasons why it's different than in the case of the emergence of the U.S., is that there are strong and powerful other, actors in the region. But as Neil said, what this will end up doing, if the Athenian Spartan case is the touchstone, is that the relationships with these allies will evolve and adapt and adjust, and the entanglements with the allies can often end up becoming the reason why one thing leads to the other and the two parties end up somewhere they don't want. India, I think, is a wild card. India, I mean, I'm probably prejudiced about India because I'm too much influenced by Lee Kuan Yew. So in my book on Lee Kuan Yew, we have a great chapter on the future of India. It's a terrific book. This is not this book, a previous book, the one with Blackwell, where it's a great book because 90% of the words in there are Lee Kuan Yew's words. So we just do the questions, he does the answers. So this is with my colleague Bob Blackwell, a former ambassador to India, who's I call him Swami Blackwell now, so he's very attached. So with malice aforethought, I asked this question to Lee Kuan Yew. I said, many people say India's going to overtake China. What do you think? And he says, young man, do not use India and China in the same sentence. He says, that's how I thought, okay. Then he said, and this is when Blackwell almost fell off of his chair, he said, India is not a real country. He said, instead, it's 24 principalities that happen just to be united by the British rail line. I'm not betting on India, yes.
I'll take the other side of that bet. 10 years ago, I predicted that it was the tortoise and the hare, and as in the fable, the tortoise would overtake the hare, and in growth rate terms, that has happened. I think India is fascinating in a number of respects in this context because it's not quite clear how it's going to play the US-China rivalry. There was, and I think this is part of Bob Blackwell's strategy, an idea back in the time of the Bush administration that India could become a really solid ally of the United States in a kind of quasi-containment strategy. And that hasn't really worked out.
Well, as Bob says, if you want to clear a room of Indians, say the word containment. So basically, the Indians want to play their hand And the other thing, if you read the chapter on the rise of China, every 2 years since the great financial crisis, and this is a fact, every 2 years, the increment of growth in China has been equal to the total GDP of India. So just to put it in perspective.
Let's take some more questions. Now let's see, I'm determined to get gender balance in this discussion, so I'm going to go to the lady who's sitting in the second row there.
Hi, I'm Unso. I'm a historian, doctoral student in the history department here.
Great.
And my question is, I'm interested to know your thoughts on contextualizing in a longer history of China, where we view China as perceiving itself as the original primary power until its downfall in the mid-19th century, and that, and so I wanted your thoughts on this.
Sure, great question. So, long before Donald Trump became famous with his slogan, "Make America Great Again," Xi Jinping became president of China, and his slogan in colloquial is "Make China Great Again." It's called the Great Rejuvenation of the Great Chinese People. And contextualizing it just as you say, from Chinese perspective and Chinese narrative, and all Chinese will tell you this story, China was great forever, for 5,000 years. China was the dominant power in the world, they think, for 5,000 years. Their world only included the area that they could see, but still. And then there was this 200 years of anomaly in which Westerners came and exploited them and imperialized them and invaded them and fought wars with them and dominated them. But now that's over. We're getting big and strong again ourselves, back to our just normal place. And our normal place in the Chinese narrative is at the top of the universe. So China's sense of international order is a hierarchical dominance in which China is at the top of the pyramid and everybody else is somewhere lower in the pyramid. And the principal injunction in Confucian terms is know thy place. So thy place is not China's place. China's place is at the top and other people are adapted or adjusted from that point. So I think as they look and see what's happening, and as Xi Jinping talks to people that work with him, he says, we're just basically restoring, we're not rising. They even say we're not rising, we're just restoring ourselves to where we were before, and we would have been otherwise. I point out to them that, wait a minute, you were big only, you had a big GDP only because you had a lot of people. They were all miserably poor, like everybody else in the world, to the Industrial Revolution. I mean, as Neil's book points out, until the Industrial Revolution and per capita income began to grow, everybody was miserably poor. So if you have a lot of miserable poor people, yeah, okay, you have a bigger GDP, but therefore, so what? Okay, they didn't have Industrial Revolution, they didn't have technology, they didn't have a market economy. So basically, they've now imported what's basically the march of civilization, but still for the purpose, as you say, of restoring China to where it ought to be, at the top of the pyramid.
One of the things that's fascinating about this, and I like this question very much, is the way in which historical narratives become a part of the way in which strategic questions are framed. And it's absolutely true that there is this story, which has been, of course, reinforced by some Western historians, that the period from the 1840s to the 1940s is an anomalous century, and that we're really reverting to a kind of norm. This is a kind of Ken Pomerantz story. So the American narrative, of course, is a completely different one, and it's still fundamentally one in which there's a providential exceptionalism to the United States. I've just been reading Arne Westad's New History of the Cold War, which is not yet out. Arne, whom I think I managed to help lure to Harvard.
You did.
This is one of the arguments he makes, that the American sense of exceptionalism is the kind of ideological component. That's the narrative on the American side, and that's still very much intact, even in a slogan like Make America Great Again. Let's get some more questions in before we're out of time. I'm going to go right to the back, and there's a young man there with sandy-coloured hair. Yes, you, sir. If you could just get a microphone.
Hi, thanks very much. My name is Leo. I'm an international policy master's student. I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are about whether the actions of Donald Trump in seemingly voluntarily pulling away from the international order makes you more or less sanguine about the prospects of conflict between the US and China.
And just briefly more, yes. So I think that, as I mentioned before, I think the idea that the ruling power trying to maintain some level of order in which the rising power would adapt and adjust, because obviously the rate of adjustment or the types of adjustment depend on the underlying correlation of forces. So my strength, if I'm the ruling power, can be enhanced by my relationships with other strong powers and by other powers' respect for what we're trying to accomplish together. So if the ruling power retreats from various domains, it's not surprising that Xi Jinping at Davos, lavished the spotlight, as when people say, "Great leader, you're leading our global financial liberalization and economic." He thinks that's fantastic. And Chinese like being respected as they become more. And I think in the climate space, I would expect he will be doing the very same thing.
Can I just appeal to those people who haven't yet muted their phones to do it? We're really trying our best to carry on this conversation without jingles interrupting us. Let me go over to this side of the room, and there's a gentleman in a red shirt just on the edge there. Yes.
Hi, I'm Isaac. I'm a freshman here. I was wondering if you could talk about, so for the past 70 years, we've seen what an American-led international order looks like. What would a Chinese-led international order look like?
Okay, that's a great question, and I can't give a good answer, but I think it's one worth contemplating. I think, again, I'm a red-blooded, even red-necked American, so I come from North Carolina, and I can't imagine, I know that somewhere, either in the Bible or in the Constitution or in some authoritative document, it says USA means number one. So I have no doubts who the good guys are. So I don't believe in moral equivalence. I think we're the good guys, and other guys I have doubts about. So
It's amazing you lasted so long at Harvard, really, Graham, with views like that.
well, I put my shirt up from time to time so that people don't quite notice.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that the reason that's a hard question to answer is that the Chinese generally do not articulate a vision of what that would look like. On the contrary, the standard line is, we are far too preoccupied with our domestic problems to even think of such questions. And so there's a quite deliberate avoidance of the scenario that you're alluding to, even as a whole series of Chinese projects go forward that are clearly designed to expand China's influence. The Belt and Road, or One Belt, One Road project is an example of this large-scale Chinese investment in a whole bunch of foreign countries, almost global in its scope. Graham mentioned the financial innovation that's going on. So the fascinating thing for me about China's rise is that it continues to be relatively quiet and understated. And here the analogy with Wilhelmine Germany, with pre-1914 Germany, breaks down, because the Germans are always insisting that they, or at least their leadership was constantly insisting that they were entitled to be a world power. And it was this stridency of German rhetoric that probably contributed to what Paul Kennedy called the rise of the Anglo-German antagonism. The Chinese are very interesting in this respect. They learn from history. Now, one reason that Graham and I got interested in applied history is that we began to suspect we were living in the United States of amnesia, where there is no attempt formally to inculcate historical knowledge in senior officials of the US government. This is not new, it's been going on for many years. Kissinger complained about it in the 1960s. But when you go to Beijing and you talk to senior officials there, you realize that they systematically study history, that the Standing Committee of the Politburo has reading assignments from Wang Qishan. I'll bet your book is the latest one. In fact, I'm prepared to bet it's already being read. Graham, can you confirm or deny that it's already being read by members of the Chinese government?
So I can tell an anecdote. So I was at dinner in New York last week as part of this rollout, and a high-level financial person had just come back from this One Belt, One Road event that Xi Jinping held in China, and they said that Wang Qishan had got him on the side and said, "What do you think of this Thucydides trap book?" And he said, "It's not published until next week in the U.S." And Wang Qishan said, "Well, I read my copy last week and it's fantastic, but I want to ask you about this or that." So there's a Mandarin edition already circulating there, not with copyright. Yeah.
And this, well, not necessarily. They may be reading the galleys, which have been widely circulated, and they may even be reading it in English in some cases. This is an amazing and illustrious list that you're joining. I first heard of Wang Qishan's reading list when I discovered that everybody on the Standing Committee had been asked to read Tocqueville's Old Regime and the Revolution. Oh, yeah. Then it turned out that there was a book at the height of the European financial crisis. They were all reading a short history of Europe. So this is the list to be on. It's not what Mark Zuckerberg is reading that matters. It is undoubtedly what Wang Qishan is reading. Let's get a couple more questions in before we're right out of time. I'm going to carry on pursuing gender balance. There's a lady right in the middle of the middle block there. If you can pass the microphone to her, I'd be really grateful. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm interested in, since we're talking about war, between China and America, the time frame, because there was a study commissioned by the U.S. Army of Rand Corporation, and it says that the title is "Thinking Through the Unthinkable." It seems that since there is a great discrepancy still between the military capacities of U.S. and China, so an earlier war, let's say, within the 10 years, which is from 2015 to 2025, would be an advantage to America that could maybe wage a war, and the war would be taking place on China and strike China so hard that would set back China's development for another 50 years or so, rather than waiting to 2015. I wonder if you can comment on this question of time frame. So maybe when China really caught up with America in terms of military capacity, there might be less chances of war between China and America.
Okay, good, very good question. So there is an excellent RAND study that I cite in trying to do the military balance between the U.S. and China. And there's no question, the U.S. Defense Department spends more than the next 5 competitors combined. So the U.S. has invested in defense in a big way for a long time and is clearly strongly superior to China in almost every domain. But if you look at the events, for example, a naval war in the region, this becomes a very different picture. And that's what the RAND study points out, that basically, since the Chinese can play from the land and the Americans have to play from the sea, as well as from the bases in the region, including in South Korea or in Japan or in Guam, if I have to operate my carrier, for example, in the South China Sea, and all you have to do is build missiles on the land in China, $1 million missiles can destroy $1 billion carriers. So that's not a good game. The Chinese they're not required to play symmetrically, so they can play asymmetrically. So that's the big point about that study. The other point, though, with respect to the thesis here, so the thesis is not that because I'm bigger and stronger than you are and I see you rising, I think it's a good time to go to war with you. In almost none of my cases does somebody decide this is a good idea, let's go to war. Or that the rising power thinks, all right, now I'm big and strong enough, I think I'll go to war with you. Again, that would be, there's a couple of cases like that, but that's a big exception. Most of the cases, and the most worrisome cases, are we're in this structural dynamic that Thucydides described, and third-party actions, not our actions, some other event, some other place, ends up having an impact on this interaction. So in the North Korean case, we're not I mean, if I believe, and I agree 100% with what Neil said, if Xi Jinping could say to Kim Jong-un, do this, do that, and he would do it, he would say it. He's told them. The relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang is very stressed. Never have the Chinese been willing to accept Kim Jong-un to come and visit. Even the premier has never gone to visit there. I talked to a Chinese colleague just recently. I said, well, how do you talk to this guy? They said, well, our ambassador can't even go see him. The ambassador in Pyongyang. They said, well, we can talk to the ambassador, his ambassador to Beijing, and he has at least some ability to communicate messages. This is a very stressed relationship. So here a third party could take an action, though, that, as we were describing before, that could end up in this cascade. So I think I think the military balance is very relevant, but I think the vulnerability to war is more a function of these entanglements with the third parties than it is with whether I'm just a little bit stronger or a little bit weaker.
A phrase I've heard recently from Chinese officials relating to the original Korean War is that China and the United States were dragged into war in Korea. And I've heard that phrase often enough to think that it's become a certain, has a certain official status. Of course, the reality is that China became involved in the Korean War because Stalin told Mao to do it. And when you tell that story, I gave a lecture on the Korean War at Tsinghua, you realize that you're entering a very, very fraught terrain, because you have to acknowledge that the founder of the People's Republic was made a fool of by Stalin and turned into a proxy for Soviet policy in 1950-51.
Absolutely.
We have time, I think, for one more question, Graham, and then we're going to wrap it up. I'm going to just allow one of our senior faculty members to ask the last question. I managed to get a freshman in. I'm very pleased that I did that.
Yeah. I'm glad that a freshman came. Yeah.
Freshman, one of my students, so that's,
okay.
that's good too.
Not surprising.
You don't
Scott
tell me
Sagan.
you ordered him to come.
Scott Sagan from CSAC in the Political Science Department. Graham, like you, I was really worried when Donald Trump said this is not going to happen, because that puts you into a red line, a commitment trap problem. And yet, Donald Trump is remarkably inconsistent. He could back down on the torture issue. He could say NATO was obsolete, and now it's not obsolete. He could say, I want to go to Kim Jong-un and talk to him.
Right.
So should we be as worried about red lines? On the one hand, this is a person who can be vindictive. On the other hand, it's a person who is stunningly inconsistent.
A bit like Kaiser William II, actually.
Oh my God.
Not a particularly reassuring thought, is it?
I mean, I was about to be, and I think it's nice to end on an up note, and I appreciate Scott's optimism. I think certainly given the nature of the campaign, in which China was demonized as the source of every problem, the new flip-flop is, I think, preferable, okay? Though it's clearly one in which there's no set strategy or no notion that there's necessarily continuity in this. As one of the Chinese that had been involved in the Mar-a-Lago summit said, you know, they were thrilled that they got through it and things turned out as well as they did. And then he said, but we know we're just one tweet away from, you know, off in some other direction. So the notion of whether this is a consistent thrust that was likely to be continued or not, you rightly say there's a lot of uncertainty about. I think in trying to decipher, though, and I would wish, therefore, that, okay, there's a very strong national security team. So H.R. McMaster is a great national security advisor. Mattis is a great Secretary of Defense. Tillerson, I think, is going to be a very strong Secretary of State. So there's a big team there of serious people, and they are going to think through the consequences before one just takes an action. At the same time, if you ask most San Franciscans or most people in Palo Alto, how do you feel about Kim Jong-un being able to launch a nuclear weapon against San Francisco? I'm telling you, I mean, ask somebody at the restaurant or, you know, even on the campus, they'll say, what? You know, I mean, who? How? No. Okay, no, absolutely not. And if you say, well, what risk would you be prepared to take to prevent that? They said, well, I don't want to take any risks. I just don't want it to happen, so they don't want to be consistent about it. So I think it's quite possible this is a visceral sense that he has, that I have to stand for something, and I stand for a great America that's strong, and it's not going to allow a little country like that to do this. And if you, China, don't solve this problem, I told you, I am going to solve this problem. So I would not discount the proposition that if the Kim Jong-un train continues down the track, we will see not just a credible threat to attack, but that we'll see an attack. And then we'll have to see where that leads. And if you, Scott, as I have studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you look at it in retrospect and you think, wait a minute, would you run a 1 in 3 chance of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union to prevent them having nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba? Excuse me, they already have nuclear-tipped missiles in Russia, the Soviet Union, that could kill you. So they can kill you 20 minutes earlier. Boy, that's a big deal, that you're going to run a 1 in 3. This makes no sense. And actually, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, once Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy began to sense this, they had the feeling, what the hell are we doing? How did we get into this situation? And that's why they became so inventive at the end. So I'm hoping, if I end on a sort of positive note, I'm hoping that as this national security team works their way through this problem and sees, my God, down this path we could find ourselves actually in a war with China. And if that happened, we're all going to go to hell, and that's crazy. We'll become inventive. And I think if they became inventive, if the US and China were working together, there's more than one solution to this problem. Yeah.
With that, I think I'm going to give Amy Zegart the last word. But thank you, Graham.
I think I speak for everybody when I say never has it been so enjoyable to talk about so much doom. Destined for War is destined for purchase on the tables outside, right outside the doors. Please join me once again in thanking Neil and Graham.
Thank you very much. Oh, we missed you. Oh, that was great.